Let's get started on the subject of risk aggregation. As exactly as Raghu said a short while ago, origination, aggregation, risk transfer are neat and clean concepts, but the moment you delve into them, they are smeared together, and you do end up having to walk up and down on them, and I will similarly mix up things. I find it very useful to think of a black box called the financial system. Okay, so imagine you did a merger of every single financial firm, and you had a single representative financial firm. So on one hand, you've got all these originators who are putting a bunch of risks into the financial system. Now what is happening inside that financial system? There's a lot of hot potato trades taking place between financial firms. Financial firms seem to love to take on a risk, transform it by epsilon, sell it to the next guy who transforms it by epsilon. So there's this enormous amount of gross turnover and gross positions that take place in trades between financial firms and financial firms. But for the present moment, I just don't care, because I think it's useful to think of the financial system as a black box. So that risk is going into the financial system. Now what do they do with it? What happens in there? That's the aggregation function. What can happen with it is very limited, and I think it's insightful and useful to think about. The first is risk can be destroyed by diversification. And diversification is the only free lunch in all economics. So it's just absolute free lunch to the extent you can humanly diversify. It's only better, and we should always be demanding that the financial system be able to put together more and more diverse, uncorrelated risks and quench that risk by diversification. So that is number one. Number two is the financial system would like to and would try to beam those risks out into the household sector. So you want risks to go sit on household balance sheets, and to the extent that you can do that, you've transferred the risk. The third is that you beam risks out to the rest of the world, which is again, from a single country perspective, it's an absolutely wonderful thing that if you can send something to some Japanese insurance company or to some hedge fund in Connecticut, it's a free lunch. So it's a great way to proceed, and it's a basic finance intuition about why financial globalization is a good thing. To the extent you can send those risks out, you're always better off. The global pricing of India-specific risk will always be lower than the India pricing of India-specific risk. The residual risk is a puzzle, and it needs to be understood. The residual risk is on the balance sheet of financial firms, which are ultimately owned by the household sector and some foreigners. So now that's the interesting and troublesome piece that we need to think about, and in many ways, the rest of this show is about that. But I think conceptually, this is a useful way to think about it. This is the entire functional approach on financial systems. This is the big idea which has helped all of us think more effectively. That think of the financial system as a black box which takes in all these risks, and then there is only a finite list of things that can happen. It can die by diversification, it can get sent out to the households directly, it can get sent abroad, and whatever can't be sent abroad or quenched by diversification, or whatever can't be sent to the households, is sitting inside the financial firm, which means it is on the balance sheet of the owners of those financial firms, who are both local and non-local. Again, to the extent that they're foreigners, all the better, because you've sort of beamed that risk out. Maybe because I'm in India, which is a bit of a closed economy, I think too much in terms of this boundary of India as organizing principle. That's not the way the literature talks about it, but I find it useful. Okay, so in this way of thinking, what would be a good world in terms of that risk aggregation function getting performed well? And actually, before I get to well, let me just play a thought experiment. So suppose the risk aggregation function has many deficiencies. We'll come to the kinds of deficiencies. What are the economic consequences? What goes wrong if you make mistakes in the way that risk aggregation function is organized? I could think of two kinds of things that would be bad in that world. One is an intuitive idea which I'm not sure I can put an asset pricing theory to, which is that you would drive up the cost of capital. So suppose risk goes and sits on the wrong place. So there is some originator who's trying to send some risk into the financial system. The financial system will end up charging too much for that risk. Now, it shouldn't happen in a perfect world, but it seems reasonable that if the financial firms are not doing a good job of doing the diversification and beaming the stuff abroad and so on. So if you end up with a lack of diversification, and if some decision maker in a financial firm starts saying that, hey, I want a risk premium for this, it's not the way asset pricing theory encourages us to think, but my intuition is that maybe some of those things do happen. You end up charging more for that kind of risk. Also, there is the same theme of global pricing of risk factors versus domestic pricing of risk factors. To the extent that capital controls or home bias interfere with risk transmission abroad, then you end up with local pricing of risk factors, and that ends up giving you higher cost of capital. So there's that one level of direct impact upon the economy, that the products and the prices shown to households and firms are driven up when the aggregation function is not done. Another dimension is systemic risk. That to the extent that we make mistakes in the aggregation function, we'll often end up holding the risk in the wrong places. We will just do nonsensical things. So, for example, the way we think about the United States subprime crisis was that risk was going to all the wrong places, and then when the right combination of shocks came along, we ended up with a big systemic crisis. So I think these are the two perspectives on judging quality of the aggregation function. That if the financial system works well, then what we should end up with is a nice, stable, robust financial system where the cost of capital is low. And if we make mistakes in how that aggregation function works, we end up with an elevated probability of a systemic crisis, and we probably end up with a higher cost of capital. But at least I think I don't understand that fully. It seems like a reasonable thing to say, but I'm not sure I understand it properly. Okay, now what are the features of a good world of risk aggregation? And that's what this slide is about, that we'd like to have a large number of these financial firms who are able to pick up these risks and do the hot potato thing with each other. We'd of course like to have markets with good pricing so that the information flows correctly and that helps to produce a good risk allocation. Then you have to open the governance box inside each of these financial firms. So to the extent that there are misalignments of incentives within the financial firms, they will end up doing the wrong thing. So financial firms should have the incentive to think properly about measuring, monitoring, pricing, and managing that risk. And which is related to the external regulatory environment, that to the extent that the government is demanding good things out of those financial firms, that will drive the managers of those financial firms to think straight about what is my internal yield curve and what ALMs am I carrying, and am I really pricing the risks that I'm taking properly. Now, on a closely related theme, we get to the problem of failure. That this entire beautiful Rube Goldberg contraption can get derailed when you get to failure that is not being handled properly. So I think an integral part of this story is the resolution question. We need to think about how these things fail, and we need to be able to handle their failure properly. And just as I said a short while ago about the failure of originators, all of us need to start getting away from this deposit insurance metaphor. The problem is not closing down banks, the problem is closing down financial firms. But to clearly say to ourselves that there are firms all over the landscape in the financial system, and we've got to have a resolution capability that shuts down firms without saying whether it's a bank or an insurance company or it's AIG or it is KGFS or whatever. I mean, when a firm goes bust, we need a resolution capability for those firms. Going further into the way the government thinks about this, we need there is going to need to be a systemic risk regulation function somewhere in the economy, and that office, or that team, or that agency is going to need high quality data about who are, or what is this map of the risk aggregators of the economy, who are they, what risks do they carry, how are they connected to each other, both from the viewpoint of risk assessment and from the viewpoint of resolution. So I mean, look back at Bear Stearns, look back at Lehman. We need to understand who is this creature, what are his contracts, what is his book like, what is his risk, and then when things go bad, we have the ability to shut him down better. That also links to the too big to fail question, that you would like this whole thing to be humming smoothly without some giant things that are essentially impossible to close down. Because every time that happens, it's a sure recipe for trouble, because the agency that is too big to fail knows that it is too big to fail. Now, from that framework, let's start looking at the Indian economy, and are there some insights and are there some interesting thoughts that we can offer. The first odd thing that we see in India is that Indian non-financial firms have a very high reliance on internal financing. So this is just a simple empirical fact that Indian financial firms use very little external finance, and they mostly do internal finance. And there's a long story in the finance literature about why external financing is a good thing, and there are many healthy features of external financing. But this is actually also a reflection on the financial system, that there's actually not a lot of intermediation taking place. So if corporate governance and the financial system worked well, then firms with low quality projects would beam out dividends, and that money would get recycled through the financial system and come back into other firms. That whole intermediation process is really not happening too well, and we just seem to have a non-financial sector that is running its own internal capital markets and a financial sector, and the two are not as deeply enmeshed as should be, and this, I think, is a mixture of a lack of capability on the part of the financial firms and corporate governance problems on the part of the non-financial firms. Then if we look at the overall credit market of India, then we see this huge scale of resource preemption, where actually there is really just 30% of the overall commercial credit of the economy which is going back to the large firms. There are large chunks of this money which are just being driven by regulation. They're not being driven by rational thinking on the part of the financial firms. This is not a very bright thing. Nachiket had mentioned earlier today that the non-financial firms are outgrowing the capabilities of the financial firms. So on this graph here, what we have on the left-hand side is the assets of the top 10 companies in 2011, and you see these firms are pretty big. And on the right-hand side, you see the exposure limits of the top 10 financial firms. And what is, in short, what has happened is Reliance is too big for SBI. Okay, so India's growth has driven Reliance off the charts when compared to the capabilities of SBI and its ilk. And the writing is on the wall, because if you just project a little into the future, I think this problem is becoming acute. Eli and I have done lots of work on the rise of Indian multinationals, and this is one theme that we clearly see, that there is a real synergy between an Indian firm growing up into becoming a multinational, plugging into global capital markets, accessing global corporate finance, and one of the drivers for that is really the lack of capability of the Indian financial system, that we're just not able to serve the needs of the biggest financial firms. This is the familiar data on the screen about the financial deepening in India, even as compared to another country like China, which is not that far from us in economic development, and we seem to be far behind where they are. One of the peculiar things in India is that, in a way, the government dominates the game of risk aggregation. The largest financial firms are government companies, and this is a really troublesome thing. All too often in India, we end up with this ideological debate about public sector banks or not, and I think that in the international literature, we are much more clear and convinced that there are real problems with public sector ownership of financial firms, that bureaucrats as bankers don't work very well. I think the Indian debate is out of touch with the kind of consensus that we find on these questions outside the country. What goes into the public sector inevitably turns into politics. So, for instance, Nachiket said something that worldwide we have moved away from defined benefit pensions towards defined contribution pensions. And at first blush, from first principles, it seems like a bad idea. Household balance sheets are probably not a good place to place those kinds of risks. My story is, it's politics. That the reason why defined benefit pensions are a bad idea is because defined benefit pensions are inevitably backstopped by a government in a world where private financial markets simply don't exist for those kind of claims. So on those kind of horizons, those private markets don't exist. So it becomes politics, it becomes public balance sheet. And then you get this extremely toxic interplay between a large bunch of voters who are pensioners and the ability of the public sector to then come up with incredible distortions in the pension system, rack up very irresponsible pension policies. So my working assumption is that all over the world we moved out of DB pensions towards DC pensions, because you can't burden politics with these kind of challenges. So it's better to say that it will be on a household balance sheet. So it's a problem, it has its own consequences, but it's just far safer for a country to not have pensions as part of the public sector balance sheet.
A lot of the corporate sector, right? The US corporate sector has moved almost completely away from defined contributions to defined benefits to defined contributions. There's no political issue there, it's just incentive.
But that was an example in my mind about the sorts of problems that we are encountering because of the domination of government in the landscape of the large financial firms. Looking at the debt market, we really don't have much of a debt market. So there's this entire story that should have arisen about firms and their claims and the issuance and all that. And the story hasn't even begun. We've just comprehensively failed to create a meaningful debt market. There is a small rise of AAA issuance, but beyond AAA, there seems to be nothing that comes out. This is an example of the kind of distortions induced by regulation. That it seems to me that regulations in India are simply hostile to low-grade credit. And it's just a bunch of mistakes in the regulation which have created this strong bias that if you are an investor in a bond, you will just buy a AAA bond. You will not go for any of the weaker credits. By the time you get to junk bonds, then there's a different set of issues that we don't have the resolution capability. The bankruptcy code is not there and so on. But it doesn't have to be that you're only stuck in AAA. There should have been a little more movement behind AAA, but unfortunately, that has not yet happened. Then, in the whole story of risk and risk management and the contracts between the financial firms and the rest of the world, derivatives should matter greatly, but there are only a few areas where we seem to have got some contracts working. And for the major part, the financial system does not have these tools to do the stuff that they have to do. Now, I think one of the most important elements of the risk aggregation story is regulation. To the extent that the behavior of financial firms is distorted by regulation, we are going to get all kinds of difficulties, and a lot of work needs to be done in rethinking how we are approaching this. One of the issues is that we've got this multiplicity of regulators for different sectors. So there is LIC and there is SBI, who are each behemoths with somewhat different perspectives on what is risk and how you think about risk. And then what tends to happen is that the trade ends up with one or the other, not on its rational merits, but on subtle differences between the regulations. So because some IRDA regulation sees a trade differently from how some RBI regulation sees a trade, and that's where the trade goes and sits. It's not a rational information-based story, but rather just the distortion caused by inconsistencies in regulations. We really don't have the ability to see across market activities, particularly for the large complex financial firms. That I think logically there is an ICICI conglomerate. I don't know whether inside ICICI there is a conglomerate scale MIS which the CEO examines every Friday, but I'm sure that the government needs one. The government needs to look at a consolidated statement about ICICI every Friday, and there's just no capability in the government system to work cutting across these regulators to take a comprehensive view of who these financial firms are, what are their exposures, and what they are doing. Now, in terms of capital, there are some real problems. I'm running out of time. I just want to focus on an ALM and a mismatch issue. The rules seem to be consistent with a significant amount of maturity mismatches, and this is something that I'm actually curious about. Are our rules particularly different from what you see in the rest of the world? Because I just want to go one step ahead. Okay. So, as was mentioned several times in the room today earlier, we've got this peculiar phenomenon that there are these infrastructure projects which want long-dated investments, and there is no long-dated corporate bond market. Now you're short of places in the economy. Where will you keep this? And it's all ending up on bank balance sheets. So there's two little graphs there showing you the maturity mismatches with ICICI and SBI. And I'm curious, that is it that RBI regs in this area are different from what we see in the rest of the world? Or are these firms in violation of the rules? So how are these mismatches coming about? Because I think these duration gaps are pretty large. The duration of equity of these firms is fairly high, and I'm not fully understanding what is it about these rules which are allowing them for these large mismatches to arise. And again, this is about mispricing of risk. So if SBI is able to hold a 10-year bond and is able to hold a large mismatch at 10 years, now see what it does to the investment banking, because now a project comes along, say you're doing this Tirupur water contract, and the investment banker basically says, hey, I can get away with some 9.3% interest rate on this bond because I've got this guy who's willing to take the 10-year risk, and even though he's actually not very well equipped to bear that risk is going on to SBI shareholders, because ultimately it's turning into the duration of equity. But because there is a problem in the regulation, it turns into a problem in the pricing, it turns into a misbehavior by the investment banker, it turns into wrong corporate financial structure for the water utility in Tirupur. So you get all these consequences that flow from an odd situation in the regulation. Finally, I want to turn to the problem of resolution. At present in India, we have two elements of the resolution story. One is the DICGC, which has a grant name, Deposit Insurance and Credit Guarantee Corporation. Unlike what we might think, most of the time the DICGC does not really do much of what you would expect in a deposit insurance corporation. It pays out to depositors after the bank is bust, and it has turned into a resource transfer system from commercial banks to cooperative banks, and it really does not exert any supervisory capability, and it never preemptively shuts down a bank while it is solvent. So it's not at all there in terms of being remotely capable as a deposit insurance corporation. The little box there is a set of ideas from Raghu's report, that's the other Raghu, from Raghunath Rajan's report on deposit insurance. And there is a lot that needs to be done on getting that going. But I would also emphasize that while we are on the project of building a resolution capability, we should be thinking about it on a financial system scale and not just for banks. The other interesting piece, which in my opinion is working fantastically well, is the National Securities Clearinghouse, the clearing corporation, the NSCC. NSCC has a bunch of clearing members, and there is an online real-time value-at-risk risk management system. And when a firm runs out of capital, its trading privileges get shut off intraday in real time, and the firms go bankrupt all the time, and that's perfectly okay. So there's absolutely no ripples. India is unusual in that clearing members go bust all the time. So I mean, internationally, it would be a once in a 5-year or once in a 10-year event that a clearing member goes bust. Most of the time, clearing members don't go bust. Clearing members tend to have hundreds of millions of dollars of capital. India is remarkable in that fairly small, fairly fragile firms become clearing members. And in my opinion, that's been a great policy because it has given NSCC war drill all the time. NSCC faces clearing member failures all the time. And it's supremely able and comfortable to do this. So the entire risk management system inside NSCC is battle tested all the time. Again and again, clearing members fail, and you never even hear about it. In the mid-90s, there would at least be newspaper stories that so-and-so was a clearing member in NSCC and he went bust. Today, you don't even get those newspaper stories anymore. People are bored because it just goes. So the entire netting by innovation of the clearing corporation is a great success story of an effective resolution capability which has been built in India and is delivering. What are some of the big things? What are some of the big things that are in the pipeline and are going to reshape this environment in the days to come? The first is a new office of the Ministry of Finance, which is called the FSDC. FSDC stands for the Financial Stability and Development Council. So FSDC is a very interesting animal. It is not statutory, so there is no law that makes FSDC. It's not a separate organization. It's an office sitting inside the Ministry of Finance. The premise is that FSDC will be able to take an across-silo perspective upon Indian finance. So the problem we have in our legacy regulatory architecture is that there is RBI which sees one small piece of the puzzle, there is SEBI which sees one small piece of the puzzle, there is FMC, there is IRDA, there is PFRDA, and then there are some other things in the financial system. Whereas there is no place which is able to take an across-system perspective. FSDC is interesting and important because it is the first attempt by the government of India to take an across-financial system perspective, to be able to think about certain questions which are cross-cutting. And the two most important cross-cutting questions are financial stability and development. So financial stability is, of course, a cross-cutting system perspective. I mean, if there is one thing that I think all of us have got out of the global crisis, it is don't see one small piece at a time. Don't see the London money market as just a money market. Don't see Northern Rock as just Northern Rock. Look on a financial system scale, because the complexity of the interactions and the way things come together has been surprising and bewilderingly complex. So we really need to get out of our silo mentality and stop seeing one piece at a time, which is what all the existing agencies are programmed to do. So financial stability is a cross-cutting function. And on many, many issues of financial development, we have been trapped because of the cross-cutting dimensions. So take financial inclusion as an example. Take the discussion earlier today about advisors and consumer protection and the conversation between the financial system and households. Or take the bond market. I mean, these are things which have just been trapped because they become the football between many, many government agencies, and problems don't seem to get resolved. Whereas in FSDC, which is chaired by the finance minister, we have an opportunity for the first time of pulling these agencies together, being able to thrash out issues around the table and force decisions as opposed to some of the earlier coordination structures where conversations took place but decisions didn't. So I think FSDC is an important development, and it is in progress. It is a pale shadow of what it ought to be, but we would all hope that it will become a potent and capable and effective agency in the days to come. The second interesting piece is the movement on credit derivatives. In this room, I don't need to say to anybody that credit derivatives are extremely important. I find myself skeptical about the way things are presently structured, about whether this market is going to work, but it's progress. It's better than where we were 1 year ago. The third interesting piece is that we're making some progress on the trading and liquidity of securitization paper, and I think we would all hope that in the long run we should get towards a much more capital markets flavor in the world of securitization, as opposed to its tight connection with banking, which is the way the securitization business works today. And the last interesting development is something which this entire meeting and this whole research project connects with so nicely, is the Financial Sector Legislative Reforms Commission, which is an effort which has been created by the Government of India. It's a group led by Justice Sri Krishna with the mandate of writing new financial law. So this is very timely work, and a lot of these ideas could potentially influence what gets done in FSMRC. So I think I'm at the end of my early story on what we should be thinking about the world of financial firms and the risk aggregation function. And for discussion, Sucharita has chosen 4 themes that we should be thinking about. The first is, what is the role of government as a large risk aggregator? Can we think deeply about what government can do in this, what government should do in this, what are the consequences for the financial system of the domination of government in the space of financial firms. I would also add there are very important political economy dimensions. So we should be thinking about it not just as a benevolent government, but rather as a venal government placed in a bad governance setting. The second is when you get to the systemically important financial firms, how should we think about conglomerate regulation, supervision, integrated perspectives, and so on. The third is how do we build high quality risk management capabilities within the financial system, and I would just underline that every mistake we make in the regulation of these financial firms induces wrong behavior on the part of those financial firms, such as the example we gave about SBI a moment ago, and that leads to distortions of pricing. So there is such a tight connection that if we make mistakes in how we give incentives to the managers of these firms, then their risk management capability tends to go in the wrong direction, and then that tends to generate mispricing of risk, and that's a misallocation of capital. Nachiket has long made a point that we have come up with an excessively prescriptive and a very detailed manual and a guidebook for how you do risk management, particularly in Indian banks, to the point where there is too little thinking that is going on. That there's just a whole bunch of checkbox compliance that's going on. There's very little thinking about risk. Some of my friends from abroad always say to me that when they meet the top management of an Indian bank, they get shocked at how little thinking there is about risk. That there's an important cognitive failure that is taking place. Risk is incredibly hard. Risk is incredibly complicated, and the present regulatory and supervisory arrangements seem to crowd out thinking about risk. They seem to say to the firms that risk is about some fixed risk management system, some manual. You check all the boxes, you're done. You don't actually need to think about risk. That's a huge problem going forward. And finally is the resolution question, that how should we be building some genuine capability like the United States FDIC, and how should we do this on a financial system?